Okay.
Okay.
Hello and welcome to the fourth session in our series, really, the theory workshop that I'm putting together with Sanford Quinta, Marina Rodriguez das Neves, and Victoria Luisa Barbo. Yesterday we looked at some very different questions. Today we're going to look at the world of AI. Now I just want to say this has been addressed many times during this festival, the Inclusive Futures Festival, I would just simply refer you to some of the talks that are already uploaded onto the Digital Futures website. For example, there is a series that I hosted called A Hitchhiker's Guide to Artificial Intelligence. There's also a presentation by Daniel Bolojan at the conference, a keynote address, which I really recommend. It's an outstanding presentation. I also gave a talk in the architecture and philosophy section, a different take on different things as well. And Wolf Prix, I should say, was due to give a presentation on his work at the opening ceremony. For technical reasons, we had to abort that session, but Wolf will be joining us on Saturday for our session on Saturday as advertised to present that same lecture. On Saturday, I think we might go on for slightly longer than usual as there's not a session after ours. Today, we're going to have to finish. We have to finish after 1 hour and 55 minutes. So I just say that was the work of just there showing the work of Core Himmelblau, Deep Himmelblau, that Wolf will be talking about on Saturday. And I'm also showing here some of the work by Daniel Bolojan, who was instrumental in the Core Himmelblau work. This is his project based on the Sagrada Familia, an exquisitely beautiful project that he spoke about so eloquently in his keynote address at the Digital Futures Conference a week ago. So I'm not going to talk about this as such, and I'm certainly not going to talk about my own work. I just want to sort of, in a sense, say something by way of introduction to our session today. And let me simply say, before I go any further, that I'm delighted that we're going to be joined by Sofia Crespo and Lev Manovich. It's a delight when I don't have to, they're so famous, I don't have to give any introduction. But I think in any case, their work speaks for themselves. Sofia Crespo will be presenting some of her work. Sofia is an Argentinian AI artist based in Berlin, currently in Slovenia, and her work is exquisite. She is among the most famous AI artists in the world, and certainly my favorite, exquisite work. And we're also joined by Lev Manovich, who again needs no introduction. Lev Manovich is currently in Korea, actually, but he's based in New York, originally from Russia. Lev is perhaps the most famous name in new media art theory. And Lev will be joining us to kind of comment on this very interesting session today. So part of the reason why I, as a kind of an architectural theorist, or a theorist anyway in general, or someone, I'm not quite sure I'd call myself a theorist, but somebody who likes to think about architecture and design, is the reason why I'm interested in this world of AI is not simply the novel forms that are coming out, but from a kind of theoretical perspective, we find ourselves in a really new and rich, fertile terrain. Not only are we forced to address the questions, let's say, of consciousness when we're dealing with AI, because the key difference between AI and natural intelligence or human intelligence is, of course, AI doesn't have consciousness, and that is a deep philosophical question. But it's also a neuroscientific question. We have a neuroscientist like Anil Seth, whose TED Talk, if you haven't seen it, is definitely worth seeing. Anil Seth is a neuroscientist who has a background in computation. He did his PhD on AI and then moved into the world of neuroscience. And this is what is in many ways that is so fascinating about this new terrain, is that we are getting those with a background in AI looking at neuroscience, such as Anil Seth. We are also getting those with a background in neuroscience, those who have done PhDs in neuroscience, who are now looking at AI. Denis Hassabis, the CEO of DeepMind in London, that was responsible for developing AlphaGo. He did a PhD in neuroscience before coming before moving full time into the world of AI, as did Geoffrey Hinton, one of the key luminaries in the world of deep learning, currently based in Canada, in Montreal, in Canada. So what's happening in a kind of very interesting and intriguing way is we're getting a convergence of different disciplines, and not only are we getting neuroscientists and AI people coming together, but also we're getting philosophers addressing similar questions, and we're getting artists and architects and designers of all kind engaging with the technique. The question is then, if you think about this as almost like a Venn diagram where all these different disciplines come together, what is the connection, and how do we see that interaction, that interface between these two different domains? So to my mind, it is one of the most challenging and interesting territories around at the moment. And it's suddenly, this new configuration of these different disciplines has suddenly developed as a new area of fertile inquiry. Daniel himself was reflecting in his keynote address on the kind of connections with neuroscience, between AI and neuroscience, and to my mind, there is a lot of to be mined in that area. We don't know the answers, but there are a lot of questions that get provoked and raised by this territory. One of the conclusions that I came out of working from working for 2 years on a book on AI is to say, it seems to me that the key issue is not about the artificiality of intelligence, but rather the question of intelligence itself, in the sense that the quest for AI is the quest for intelligence itself. There are many people who the term artificial maybe is a little bit problematic in some ways. I like to use the word synthetic, but it's clear that really that's what the issue is. So I just want to mention just briefly, and this is in many ways is both amazing but also problematic, the kind of connections between the world of the brain, of neurons and synapses of the brain, and the worlds of deep learning, of neural networks on the right hand side. The one is inspired by the other. And that's maybe all we can say. The term neuron is obviously used on the left-hand side for the brain itself, and these are the neurons in a neural network. They're connected by synapses, and the flow of information between them is governed by the weights in those synapses. But some computer scientists don't like to use the word neuron because it's so remote and distant from the actual neuron. They use the term, Melanie Mitchell, for example, uses the term unit. But nonetheless, what is so interesting is that we find certain similarities, commonalities between these two different domains. There is a curious way in which the black box of the brain itself echoes some of the operations of the black box of a neural network. And it's perhaps no coincidence there may be that the connectionism, the strand of AI that develops the area of neural network, has proved to be the most effective most recently. This is what, for example, translates languages and so on. And it's clear that although we don't know how it works, it does work. And the same, of course, goes for the brain itself. So that becomes an interesting kind of question to think about. My particular area of my particular interest has always been the possibility of thinking about how the domain of computation can maybe open up some insights into how the natural world itself operates. And I'm showing you here an early study by Craig Reynolds of what he calls boids, and that is to say, he tried to model the flocking behavior of birds. And in order to be able to model it, of course, you need to understand the rules of flocking behavior. And what was so interesting about this particular venture was that those working in bird studies, ornithologists and so on, and biologists, were able to understand what were the rules behind flocking behavior, or at least what might be the rules behind flocking behavior. And my hope is that AI itself might open up questions about what it is to be creative, what is intelligence, and what is learning itself. At the same time, we have to be very cautious when we address all those different sort of questions. So this is, again, one of my conclusions, or one of the questions I ask, is whether AI could be understood as a mirror in which we can understand what it is to be human. At the same time, I'm kind of nervous. I think one has to be very nervous about this in trying to, the danger, of course, is projecting onto the world of computation human values. This is a very famous study that was done many years ago, in the 1940s, where what we have basically are shapes, shapes on the screen. And there's the two triangles, one bigger than the other, and there's a circle, and the bigger triangle seems to be bullying the smaller triangle, and the circle seems to be trying to hide, and so on. But actually, all we have, and we read this in human terms as though there is a kind of battle going on. But all we have, actually, frankly, are shapes on the screen. So, is there a danger of projecting human values onto AI, of trying to read too much into AI through the lens of the human? Equally, is there a danger of reading too much into the human mind through the lens of computation? Are we not reducing the human mind by trying to kind of like see parallels between the way that the computers work, the way AI works, and the way that the human mind works? Those are two fundamental questions which I just want to float out there. I don't know what the answer is. In fact, we don't know the answer to anything just yet, but this terrain seems to me to be a very fertile one that is opening up questions. I wanted to simply give you one example of how a media artist has kind of connected with the world of neuroscience. This is Anil Seth, as you can see, has very popular TED talk, and if you hear it, if you watch it, you'll know why. A really astonishing TED talk. And Anil Seth, as I commented before, did a PhD in AI before working in the world of neuroscience. He's now at the University of Sussex, working with Andy Clark and others. And the theory that he's pushing at the moment, which I think is an incredibly interesting one, is the notion that the way we engage with reality is based on predictive perception. In other words, we are kind of trying to predict or guess, as it were, what is out there. The simple thesis, if I was going to reduce it down to a thesis, is that the brain is in this bony skull. It has very little sense of what is out there. It relies on, let's say, electrical signals, and it has to try and interpret those signals. So the thesis, therefore, is that what really happens is it's not just simply a question of recording what's outside and just observing it. The mind's not like some kind of camcorder, but it actually also requires a certain kind of level of engagement whereby the brain itself is also trying to predict or guess what is out there. So it's not just simply a question of absorbing information, but also actively trying to understand through perceptual predictions what is happening out there. And this leads him to come up with a very provocative conclusion that really what's happening is through this concept of predictive perception that we are, the term he uses, effectively hallucinating the world. But he makes this this comment that if hallucination is a kind of uncontrolled perception, then perception right here, right now, is also a kind of hallucination, but a controlled hallucination. Now, I found out the other week that Anil, whose work I really respect, is not. There are others within the neuroscience community, such as David Kirsch, who don't follow this line of thinking. Nonetheless, I find it particularly productive. And we had a session for the Doctor of Design program at Florida International University, where we brought him together with Memo Acton, the artist, who curiously they'd lived while they were in the UK. Well, Memo was in the UK, very close to one another, but never met. So it was great to have them come together. And this is, just by way of comparison, a kind of study that was done by Memo Acton, looking at trying to study how the brain works. Can we call this art? I'm not quite sure what you call it, but what we have on the left-hand side is a series of cloths, basically, that have been shifted around on the screen. On the right-hand side, you can see what happens when you see the world through a neural network. In other words, if Anil Seth is saying that we base things on our understanding of the world on our own predictions based on our prior experiences and knowledge, the same kind of can be seen to be happening at the way that a neural network operates. So on the right-hand side, then, this neural network has been trained clearly on the ocean, and it's taking the forms on the left-hand side and simply seeing it, interpreting it through this lens. And Memo has a series of different studies. There we have a kind of like a simple charger that becomes a rock and so on. He has a series of studies which you can check out online if you want to. The name of the project is called Gloomy Sunday, where he looks at how you can train the network on different things, on fire, on flowers, on the ocean, and so on, and at each time interpret what is on the left-hand side through a different kind of lens. That, to my mind, is hugely provocative, and I've, in my own way, I've tried to explore this in what the implications for architecture, but I won't go into my own work now. This, again, on the right-hand side, you can see it's trained, the neural network is trained on fire. So there's something absolutely intriguing about this interface between the world of, in this case, art and neuroscience, but also between computation and neuroscience. And then we could also add the world of philosophy. So between all these domains, there's a kind of very rich territory of overlap. And today, once Sofia showed us some of her work, I mean, beautiful work, it'd be great if we could maybe start opening up some of these questions about what exactly is going on and how do we understand this, because it is incredibly interesting from a kind of theoretical point of view. So there we saw clouds, and here we see flowers. A neural network trained on flowers will start interpreting Memo's hand on the left-hand side in terms of flowers. Anyway, I will stop sharing now and just float that out there as a kind of provocation for our thoughts today. So I'd like to welcome both Sofia and also Lev. It's great to have you both here today, and invite Sofia to present some of her work, and we'll take it from there. Sofia, would you like to share your screen?
Yeah, hello, thank you for having us today. Thank you, Neil, for the wonderful introduction. As you said, I'm Sofia Crespo, generative artist, and focusing mainly on tools new tools, contemporary tools such as machine learning and neural networks, and using them to reinterpret nature or to look at nature through these new technologies. And with me is Pelican McCormick, who is my studio partner and collaborator for the past 2.5 years. And it makes a lot of sense to have him here, just to bring in the discussion the points of views that we often share in our practice. So to kind of get started with our exploration, I usually really like asking the question of how can you imagine a color that you've never seen before? And I've tried this myself several times without any luck. Unfortunately, I realized at some point that I'm limited by the colors that I've been able to perceive through my lifetime. And those are the colors that I'm able to imagine color palettes with them. I'm able to imagine variations from those colors, but I can't perceive outside of the light spectrum that I'm able to perceive as a human, so outside my hardware, so to say. But we do know that there are some creatures out there, or at least we speculate that they have more photoreceptors or something that looks like photoreceptors, and we think that allows them to see the world in a more colorful way. And I very often wish that I were able to see the world like that. But going back to what I'm trying to say here is that we often ask ourselves, like, can artificial or synthetic neural networks teach us something about our own cognitive processes and how we perceive our own reality? And it's that talk that Neil mentioned, I think that's very interesting. I need to check it out, definitely, because I find the whole idea of hallucination, or like a controlled hallucination, absolutely fascinating. So something that that we've been researching with Pelican in our studio a lot is the idea of visual indeterminacy, and how the brain needs to work harder to decode or make sense of an image or a video, any kind of visual stimuli that offer some kind of indeterminacy, like a promise of something that has been seen before, but simultaneously not being able to match that to a specific element seen before. And I like very much this paper by Aaron Hertzman, who wrote particularly about how visual indeterminacy is something that has been explored in the arts way before we were able to use neural networks as tools for art, and how that's something that really engages our brain, our cognitive processes on a different or on a special kind of level. And this, like my favorite part of the paper is especially this fragment that says, in short, visual indeterminacy occurs in a seemingly meaningful visual stimulus that denies easy or immediate identification. It is the lack but promise of semantic stability. And with that, I want to share with you a few of the works that I've done, which started very much inspired by this topic, but back when I started it, I didn't know about visual indeterminacy. I didn't know why that was interesting to me. I kind of found out afterwards. I found out kind of as a post-rationalization of my work, so to say. The first series was Neuroscience, which was kind of series, or I call it like an archive of collection of specimens that of nature that attempt to visualize natureness. So to kind of take a texture that we've seen before somewhere, maybe in an image that we know maybe belongs to a sea anemone, to a jellyfish, or to an aquatic being, and kind of rearranging it so that there we see like jellyfishness, or just in general the concept of natureness, and this in a way kind of helps as well to dream new creatures, to kind of mix a color palette with the palette that we've seen before, to kind of rearrange these elements that we have perceived. And afterwards, after this series, a new one emerged, that's artificial natural history. And this one is more in the format of a book. It is actually a book that I'm working on. And with this one, I took as a data set illustrations from natural history, illustrations from various researchers and biologists and people who traveled around in the 1800s and who didn't have a camera, and who took as a job or who took on the task of drawing and trying to illustrate the natural world that they were able to see, to collect, and to create a documentation, a record for natural history that could be kept. So through this project, my attempt is to talk about how, as humans, we create units of meaning, and how we see a fish as a single organism, as a unit, and we put it together with other fishes, maybe, or to look at them in a way that makes sense to us visually. So how we visually arrange nature. And then from there, I want to move to the projects that I worked on with Pelican, who has been very responsible for our studio being able to move these explorations onto 3D, which I couldn't do just on my own.
Yeah, I mean, when we began this collaboration, we started with this project Artificial Remnants, which was an attempt to sort of start exploring that natureness, but as three-dimensional artificial life forms. And of course, these are entirely generated by neural networks. And of course, we very quickly sort of started to run into these sort of interesting questions of what is, for example, insectness, and what sort of data is available about insectness, and how do we, take the admittedly very scarce amounts of data available from the natural world in 3 dimensions and explore what kind of sort of distillations come from that again. And what we found was that we could generate these creatures, and also, thanks to copious amounts of taxonomical literature, we could also train neural networks to generate anatomical descriptions of their various parts as well as their fictitious names. And what became really quite interesting to us was that these creatures are in no way, a replacement of nature. And it becomes, painfully clear as we work more with this, that this is no way of replacing nature. We have so little data about the natural world that to attempt to create, a diverse collection of digital specimens is to absolutely fail at it, because every time you think you've generated some weird, crazy form that you've never seen before, you log on to Twitter, follow and look at a couple of insect accounts, and there's some weird beetle from somewhere, which is just, 10 times more creative form-wise and color-wise. But at the same time, what's interesting for us is that when we create these digital creatures, we allow them to, be as natives to the digital space, which also opens up for new interactions with these life forms. So for us, these works became a way of exploring interactions with digital life as a way of bridging back to natural, sort of bringing natural experiences and trying to explore what are essential experiences in digital space first and foremost. Of course, the pandemic struck at some point, and what we sort of, after a while, became very sort of acutely aware of, that one thing was to generate single specimens, but in nature, in our natural world, we and all other life forms exist in relation to each other. And as such, we would have to explore, ecosystems, and then because they help us understand something about how we are in relationship to each other, even though the digital world often appears as some kind of platonic layer above the world, that, somehow the interface, the design of your iPhone's interface, somehow feels like a platonic layer of reality rather than, something that's actually quite messily integrated and interacting with the whole world, not only each other, but ecosystems around the world are, indirectly or directly being influenced by the fact that this device is up and running in your hands. And so for us, we sort of started to look at these ecosystems, and we've sort of very quickly landed on the idea of exploring further the aquatic and specifically coral reefs, because they are such a small part of the ocean surface, so to speak, but they are so essential, such a wide diversity of life. And at the same time, we really like coral reefs because no one element is the coral reef. It's the collection of the whole, from the so-called coral species themselves, which are, these hybrid organisms in symbiosis, to all the fish, crabs, crustaceans, mantis shrimp, etc. All these planktons, all these sort of incredible diverse range of species that constitute that as a whole. And of course, what we then have found again, and perhaps even more acutely so, was we have so little data about these things. I mean, what happened with the series that Sofia works with artificial natural history is there is the scientific data available, and it's one window into a world. But in our sort of contemporary world, we often think of like our representation of the world is quite complete because of the assumptions we have that we have a lot of data about each other, humans, and it's very easy to sort of infer from there or take for granted that our representation of the natural world is somehow equally present. And it isn't. It was to the point that we had to enlist the help of a fellow artist, Joel Simon, who used genetic algorithms to generate fake corals so that we could have enough data to actually train, on the typical morphologies of coral. So why do we do this? Of course, I mean, why are we sort of like exploring a fool's errand, so to speak? And the thing is that it's to try and dream up a new ecosystem is to tell a story, and to tell stories about the world is not only to be confronted with what do I know that I can tell a story about? What do I believe in? Do I believe that this is somehow, an untouched sphere of the world? Is it an essential sphere? Is it irrelevant? Is it eye candy? But also the unknown. And there is so much we do not know about the world, but because of these neural networks and the way they distill an essence from the world, we have this ability to be confronted with a distillation of the world. I mean, I often sort of ask, like, what is jellyfishness? And when you're then, for example, collecting data set of jellyfish, images of jellyfish, how many of these are ugly jellyfish? People have a tendency to post images that they like or somehow find visually appealing. So we already have a bias or a skewing towards a preference within us in the data we make available about the natural world. And of course, it begs the question, what is an ugly or beautiful jellyfish, which, I don't believe is actually a category in reality. But at the same time, these tools neural networks allow us to explore how our worldview is actually structured and interacting with the world. And then we can use this mirror space as a way to explore that reflection of ourselves in our interaction with the natural world, and see, can we start pushing and pulling this? Can we stretch this? Can we try and inject and bring back into the digital space some kind of presence that is more than human, that involves the more than human? So of course, this is for us a series of ongoing projects, which are also, a mix of research and art. We're constantly evolving these from iteration to iteration, exploring how from sculpture to digital to augmented reality, as ways of trying to explore those interactions and to bring the more than human into the digital space, as a way of trying to stretch a little bit at the corners of our knowledge. And finally, just on that topic, our most recent project is hybrid ecosystems, where we use computer vision models that are trained on being able to very accurately describe what they're seeing as text forms, and reverting these to basically attempt to have them take and reimagine, the world. So we prompt these neural networks and attempt to have them paint for us pictures or sort of windows into worlds where we have a more hybrid, different future, basically playing within that visual mundane space, which is the limit, for example, of what it's been trained on. Often, the very typical, quite human-centric models are very typically well placed within the human domain, and then starting to try and stretch them, see if they can be pulled and pushed to imagine some more symbiotic, hybrid, inclusive future visions.
And I think, if I can add something, something that's very relevant to this series, I believe, is the dichotomy of the natural versus the artificial. The way we understand that nature is everything that isn't man-made, and the other way around as well, that everything that is artificial wasn't given to us, but rather we assemble that. And we quickly realized that this contradiction takes us to a kind of or a semi-erroneous space where we need to differentiate one thing from another. And something that these tools allow us to do is to actually connect with the natural world. We see them very much as the invention of the microscope, and how the microscope was assembled from parts that were in the world. Humans didn't synthesize the atoms used to make a microscope, but we rather took materials that were available and we used them in a way to create a tool that allows us to see things that with our naked eye, we wouldn't be able to see. And this is pretty much how, to us, machine learning and all these new technologies are allowing us to do that as well, and to do that with art, with self-expression, and with conversations in the cultural space, and in ethics as well. And for that reason, this series is more about, as Pelikan said, a window into a world where the artificial and the natural don't have to be separated from each other.
And as Sofia pointed out at the beginning, because we cannot imagine a color we've never seen before, equally so by using these models trained upon, these standard data sets of pre-trained reality, we are also trying to explore how can we not imagine something we've never seen before, but still manage to try and find ways of stretching the boundaries of our known world in ways that still can somehow lead to a different outcome. So thank you very much. And yeah, I hope we didn't go too much over time there.
That was great. We have Levis here as well, and Sampa's just joined us. It's Sampa Quinta, who's one of our team. Marina is here, and Victoria's here. Let's start a discussion first of all among ourselves, but then let's move on and open up some questions to the audience, because that was really exquisite material. Lev, maybe I could invite you to comment.
Okay, and how long my comments should be?
Well, whatever you want to say. I mean, we've got an hour and 55 minutes overall.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, just to note, so for me it's a bit late. It's 11:40 p.m. So I actually kind of wrote some comments which I thought related to the topic of this panel, which had the word neuroscience, which hasn't really been touched except one slide. But I think what I'll do is just instead of reading these comments, I'll just maybe comment on one thing of your very interesting, wonderful presentation. And I've never seen your work before. I didn't know about you, but it was very nice to meet you. And what I want to comment on is this article. I think was a guy from Adobe, right? Or somebody you quoted, where he was like trying to make a case for why this kind of GAN, right? Some of his GAN generated images are interesting, and I think a word which he used is indeterminacy. Is that correct? Yeah. And to me, sometimes I feel right, but I basically was living right in a particular world where there was some common knowledge, right? People know there's a modern art, people know there's a Picasso, people know there's a classical art, people know certain things, Kant. Even I feel like maybe between 2013 and 2018, I feel like I kind of went to sleep and woke up. I woke up in a new universe where people around me will look like human beings, except we know nothing I know, right? And and I'm just trying to come to terms with it. And this is why I'm saying it, right? A bit provocatively. So I think every single person, right, who knows anything about art knows that the basic paradigm of modernism or modern art was to make art which is ambiguous, to make art which is difficult, right? To make art which is perceptually, cognitively, doesn't have a single meaning, and to create something, right, where we kind of have to figure out what's going on, and the art sends us contradictory, signals. Maybe you have 2D and 3D, negative space, and so on, right? And this is in fact one of the key ideas, right, and paradigms of all modern art. So why he has to invent this idea of determinacy, where this is like how art has been for 100 years, I have no idea. And to me, this is like example, this is the third time I'm participating in a session of this amazing mega meta conference. And so many things I heard made me so angry. And it was wonderful because I actually wrote half a book already, right? Just trying to articulate my anger or just trying to articulate my disagreements, right? And so my comment doesn't mean, it's not meant to like shut down the discussion, to be negative, but it's simply that what I find, if you kind of just remember, right? If you remember, instead of daydreaming, right, or hallucinating, if we just instead of hallucinating, we actually remember with human history, with history of art, with history of culture, and very basic concepts, such as, for example, that the concept of art and creativity, this concept haven't been around except 200 years ago, right? This idea that the human beings did very well without having concept of art until 1800, and about having concept of creativity, right? And I kind of feel that suddenly everybody around me, almost everybody who participated in these discussions, including wonderful people from Adobe, Google, etc., it's almost like we never read Wikipedia or we never went to school, not just even to our school, and everything is new and everything is fantastic. But I think if we kind of place these things within a very basic history, right, of human culture and modern art, it's not that we become trivial. It's often become trivial, but we simply don't become revolutionary anymore, right? And in fact, again, if you look at modern art, artists invented dozens and hundreds different devices in dance, in music, in sound, in cinema, in painting, and architecture to create ambiguity, right? To create difficulty. And maybe because we now live, right, in a new era of kind of consumer popular culture, which is not about ambiguity, which is about entertainment and about kind of pleasure, suddenly people kind of have to say, oh my God, we're actually making something artistic because it's ambiguous, except we didn't go to school, so we don't know where the word ambiguous or difficult. So we're going to kind of make up a new word, indeterminate. So to me, this is just an example. This is not a comment on your work, which I think is much, much better, but it's a comment on how often the discourse which surrounds all this kind of hype around AI, creativity, art is kind of idiotic, right? Meaning it's discourse of like 1-year-olds who never basically finished high school, or I don't know what they didn't finish, right? Anyway, so that's one comment, just to be a bit provocative. And then the second comment, I like very much what one of you said, right? That we make our images and then we go to Twitter, or you can go to, in my case, I go to Wikipedia, and you look at amazing images of nature, and you kind of start wondering if humans ever would be able or were able to create anything as diverse, as fantastical, right? As hallucinatory as nature itself, right? And, if I would start my whole life now, I think I made the mistake of devoting my life to culture, which is kind of pattern-based and rule-based, right, and template-based and a bit predictable, especially in the age of billions of creators. I wish I became a biologist, right, because I think, I don't know, I don't believe in God, right, but I also don't believe in evolution, because I possibly can't believe that evolution created this endless variety of this completely surreal, right, completely grotesque, completely absurd mechanisms, devices, colors, and so on. And then I'll just add one more thing new. Right? At the same time, I wonder about one thing, right? So when I compare the best creations of humanity, I don't know, medieval European cathedrals, right? Ornaments, from Middle East from 1,000 years ago, traditional Asian paintings, right? Always wonderful things. Even something from the 20th century, Let's say paintings of George O'Keeffe, Picasso, Soutine, Robert Falk, just to name some of my favorite artists. Wonderful as we are, the humans don't seem to be able to create the same variety, the same diversity of forms, right? The same endless variety as nature is, right? And obviously what comes with modernism is this variety is greatly reduced, right? Because now you basically have this cube, which is sold to masses, because between 1900 and 2000, population of Earth has increased from 1 billion to 6.5 billion. So you have to put these people somewhere, and that's why architects kind of sell. Architects use different excuses to basically tell people to make people believe that a basic cube, right, a basic rectangle is beautiful without any colors, without decoration, because it's more expensive. And now people live in this ugly, right, reinforced concrete, decaying buildings around the world, right, except in a few places. But here's what I wonder, right? So now I'm living in Korea, and I'm close to nature. So every week, we go to a beautiful lake, and Korea is like 80% mountains and forest. And as I'm walking through a forest, right, I keep looking at the leaves, right? You have leaves of the same kind of tree. And I start wondering, was there ever a biologist who would take like 1,000 or even 500 or 10,000 leaves and actually measure their shapes and actually study systematically very patterns of variability and diversity, right? Maybe to me, it all looks diverse. All the leaves look different, right? All the coast, outlines look different, but maybe it's because my perception doesn't really see it. So the ultimate question is, right, who is more diverse, right? Our artistic creations, our cultural creations, or nature? And I think the kind of work you showed is very, very promising, but I also think we're very, very early in this technology, right? It's very low resolution still, right? The computation is not fast enough. I mean, they're beautiful artifacts, but I feel like the real breakthrough will come maybe a few years from now. But let's say you now have all the CPUs in the world available, right? All the graphics card. Can the neural networks ever produce anything which is as diverse as all the shapes in 1 square meter of a forest, right? So to what extent shall we believe this very simplistic comparison between neural networks and human brain? Yes, people already in the 1940s, right? People kind of started to think about it, but already in the 1980s, philosophers like Jerry Fodor started to criticize it. And at that point, there was lots of very lively debates about it. But I think these neural networks kind of became very successful. It kind of took over the world. Certain things which were very questionable started to be taken for granted. So it's very easy, I think, today for us to say, oh, this is like a brain, but a brain is much better, right? I mean, obviously, all the computers in the world can't possibly think on the level of like 5 months year old, not 1 year old, right? I mean, even the latest Google model of 2 billion parameters, it can only achieve 90% performance on the ImageNet. And ImageNet is an extremely artificial task, right? So perhaps this whole idea that we are on the right path with deep neural networks because they're like brain. Maybe in 5 years people say it was a completely wrong idea, right? So we'll see what happens. So as Neil said, it's interesting not because there's AI. I mean, I think AI is just a very, very small development. If I think about the phone and my camera, right, and the 32 algorithms which a phone uses to convert the light, which kind of captured by the chip onto the image, and the AI, it's like 1% of it, right? So I think whatever we pick up creative AI today is just a joke, but it's a joke which is wonderful because it does force us to ask all these interesting questions, right? So maybe artificial intelligence doesn't exist yet, but what exists is that it forces us to ask all these interesting questions about nature, creativity, art, who is more creative, who can do more variety, and that's, I think, what is interesting. So I think that's enough for now.
Yeah, I just to say, Lev, I think that all we have right now are questions, right? I mean, no answers, but it does seem a kind of provocation. There are a couple of comments I want to say, but one, a comment that your former colleague Ben Bratton made, which I think is a nice one. He said, we are only in the silent movies of computation, the silent movies period of computation right now. We haven't hardly begun, and I think AI is even newer. But I think that there's something new opening up, and what I find interesting is I don't know how I could situate the work of Memo Acton, for example. Is he an artist? What is he trying? And I think that's the interesting thing, because there's a kind of new form of practice that is emerging that doesn't conform to previous models, and it's provocative nonetheless. I know no idea what the answers are, but it does really challenge us in many ways. I wonder if I could, if whether Sanford's able to. I know that Sanford's on his phone. Sanford, are you able to? Would you like to sort of add something at all?
Oh dear! Hello. Yes, I don't know if you guys can hear me.
Yes, we can.
So I'm not really prepared to engage fully. I've been listening intermittently and watching as much as I can. I'm in the process of doing far too many things right now. However, I would like to say a couple things. First off, Lev, I want to say hello to you, man. It's been 25 years.
Actually, no, it's been about, I think it's been less. It's been around maybe 15 years when you and me were being interviewed. It was, remember, at Goldsmith where we took us and gave us cold sandwiches for lunch.
Listen, man,
And that was where we to seduce us to take a Goldsmith job. And then we took us to a bar, and the faculty said, "No, don't take the job. It's a terrible place." Okay, that was the last time.
You know,
anyway.
It was more than 15 years ago, Lev. I wish it was only 15 years ago.
Oh
In
my
any
God.
case,
Okay.
yeah, we had a lot of fun. You know, yes, they offered you the job, and then you turned it down, and then they offered me the job afterward without telling me they'd already offered it to you, and I turned it down, and I'm very glad I did. But let me just say that I feel like I abandoned you some weeks ago to hyenas in a particular Zoom session that had been staged with some, I guess, I don't know what to say, but I know you were there, and I know I didn't turn up. I was so disgusted in the and know that you had to, I knew that you had to fend for yourself and take no prisoners all alone. But anyway, I'd like to say, you know, wonderful to be with you. What I want to say, though, in terms of just a very shallow reaction, number one, I want to say that I basically agree with everything that Lev said. And I don't want to characterize the nature of the solidarity. Now, because I don't want it to become a generational thing, though I do believe it is a problem of human, and I would say intellectual and spiritual ecology. Now, I think it's a different way to say the problem, and it also leaves some things indeterminate. But I do want to say that we are faced with a fairly savage degradation on many levels of this particular aspect of human ecology, in which the products of energy and mind, of human energy and mind, are no longer really, they no longer really enter into a realm where there are systems of intelligibility, if you like, which can do, let's just say, to bring up the Darwinian metaphor, which can, in a certain sense, establish appropriate interrelated destinies for these things, for the ideas as well as the objects. And I understand, though I didn't see it the way he did, the problem of indeterminacy, because it can be a term that just sweeps aside. Now, the only reason I bother to make such a pedantic comment right now is because some of the things I heard Mr. McCormick saying, I found absolutely unexpectedly wondrous, beautiful, coherent, clear, important, and from what I could pick up, that went quite in the opposite direction of some of the larger principles that I think are ultimately presented today. That's all I really want to say. I want to say what I affirm, and I also want to say I don't really want to insist on me having the right to have said this now. We only did it because Neil provoked me. But I think that I will say there's one small thing that I disagree with that Lev presented, and that was I do not think AI is trivial. I think we're in deep fucking trouble, and I believe that there, I don't believe I think we're going to have to face this problem with a lot more criticality, honestly, and with a lot more muscle, and with a lot more expansive, just say, efforts which go beyond our disciplines in order to engage its implications, and also the dynamo which drives it, because that is not something anybody's got a handle on right now. And it goes into all areas. But I have to say that it is as if there were a new principle in our world which goes beyond, and I'm going to just pretend I'm a Darwinian here, which frankly I am, but nonetheless, which actually must be added now to the problem of now, what does he call it? Natural selection, well, whatever they are, I can't remember the two fundamental concepts of Darwin, which explains why things are coherent and work together. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. I think that I hope the rest of the debate goes in a particular direction where it is acknowledged that there is some menace. There is some real menace among us. And what we do, especially as architects, it's looking for form. I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to say this. Really? By the way, that in a sense was an invocation of the title of I think of this series. My question is, really?
Thanks, Sanford. We have a question from Dr. Shima Beji in the chat. I don't know if we can.
Yes. Hi, everyone.
Can we get your video on? Is that possible? Or you are on your phone?
Yeah. No, I am not on my phone. But hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I have a question following the presentation that actually the beautiful presentation that was provided by you guys. You spoke about semantic stability in your presentation. And that made me think about actually the opposite of semantic stability. I'm thinking, how can your AI-assisted art can be used for actually semantic perturbation instead of stability creation? Because I'm trying to actually see a way to use the way you're designing your arts as a, I don't want to say nudging people to behave better or kind of take care of nature. So I'm thinking, have you you guys both thought about utilizing your artistic presentation and creation for driving sustainability behavior, addressing some of the perception difficulties that we have in climate change, and also as a way to invite the society, collective mind to think about new ideas as a way of kind of breaking through the gaps that we have, also difficulty of changing people's mind. Instead of looking for semantic stability and kind of congruency between AI and human dream state, using it as a way to actually perturb and kind of change the way things are situated and presented.
Yeah, I think one of the problems we often have is recognizing opportunities and seeing the potential in things, and that's kind of the angle we've been sort of moving into, is trying to explore how can we try and explore also somewhat speculatively aesthetics for a different way of being. So I mean, that's where this recent series of work of hybrid ecosystems has been working towards, trying to imagine different worlds where things are more blended together in a way to try and sort of see if we can, through creating visual references, make it more likely to recognize in a different direction. I mean, it's very hard from the point of view of arts to speak very directly about things, because very often you sort of step into a kind of a lecturing tone and people very quickly shut down when you lecture them about something. So what we've been exploring more recently is like, can we use the aesthetics that emerge from this to help like broaden the sort of imagination of something, or what people can recognize in that. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Sofia.
And so I have like a few things to say. One is like on the functionality of art. Like I often get asked like, you know, or we actually recently had a panel where someone said like, you know, why are you even doing this? If you want to create representation of nature, just go and, you know, help reforest, or just go and try to like save the planet from climate change. And I completely understand that point. What we are doing isn't per se useful. It doesn't look, or it doesn't have like any kind of use to it. And I think that that in a way, it's a prevalent thing in the arts. What we do is also about self-expression. It's also about opening up a conversation. It's not necessarily something that has to directly lead to a particular action. That's on one side, and on the other side, I think like representation is important. Because when we see these technologies being used, we often see them used to represent humans. We see like human faces or we see them used to classify human behavior and to address the human directly. What we're not trying to say that what we do is so non-human, it is still human. But we're trying to address the fact that beings that don't have a face can also be generated, and they can also be a motif of art. And this isn't something that we invented. It's something that's just a matter of representation, and that was just like it's something that's important to us. Like also on the topic of empathy, which we find particularly interesting, like how we, at least cognitively, are able to distinguish human faces so well. But as Lev said, we really struggle to identify, for example, like to see diversity in like leaves, you know, unless we look like close and we try to
Can I, it's very interesting that you mentioned that, because I was thinking about animism, that, for example, there is also this kind of theories of animism. I think, I mean, my apologies if what I say is irrelevant, because I'm not coming from the background of architecture and arts, but I feel it's kind of these kinds of artistic expression has this capability of kind of like a trip, being on an ayahuasca trip or kind of a psychoactive trip without being on psychoactive substances. So kind of like an actively being on maybe digital hallucinogens, something like that. So that's why I felt like there are connection to animism and how the spirit of kind of being moved by nature and these organic forms that nature offers, maybe it can be reintegrated or reintroduced. Just an idea.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think there's an expression I really like, but I'm trying to find a better one because I don't like it being so negative. But you have the term "death by 1,000 paper cuts," and I think I see that as kind of like a very interesting model for exploring how can we sort of try and reach a more sustainable coexistence with the rest of the world. And that is that we humans have so much diversity within our cultures, who we are, personalities, and so on. And there is no one size fits all approach. And what we're trying to do, and I've disappeared, is to explore one way of exploring representation of nature, experiences of nature, artificial life within the digital space. But that isn't to say that we in any way believe that this is more than our way. And we have sort of like really want to try and encourage a diversity of expressions in that, because we think that, you know, if 1,000 artists work with nature in different ways, explore that, then the sum of those different perspectives can help, you know, enrich and trigger imagination, respect, empathy for the natural world that can in turn lead to different actions, behaviors. And I think like that's also quite important to have that sort of diversity in how we approach these topics, that not all, for example, are directs, some can be indirect, but that we, you know, as a whole move, you know, through all these small little aggregated creations can perhaps, you know, lead to a larger shift or movement or slight perspective tweak. Because a lot of the problems we face, especially within topics of AI and so on, are problems of scale. I mean, as pointed out, that, you know, the human population has ballooned over the, you know, the last 50 years in really quite an astonishing amount. So we are operating at problems where, individual actions are quite small, but the scale, the sum of these actions are huge. And that's also why it's very important to explore AI, not necessarily directly with humans, but also with the more than human, because there's questions of representation, there's questions of bias, but there's also questions of like, you know, to collect data, we need more and more data about the world, but inherently neural networks are lossy. You know, we get a distillation, we sort of end up with, you know, some essential inference, but that also excludes a lot of data. And so every time we train a model, we lose data, you know, we're sort of like accelerating loss. And as such, we're sort of like considering, you know, integrating into our society all these sort of AI systems that are inherently also, you know, reducing diversity just sheerly through the way they function. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that, but the scale of consequences can be, you know, quite quite unintended. And when we say like, you know, we couldn't get enough 3D models, you know, publicly available open source of corals, that isn't to say that we want people to go out and scan the whole world of corals. I mean, that could be hugely destructive to a marine ecosystem. So it's about trying to explore and make unveil some of that kind of like weird entanglement we have with reality. I don't know if I'm going off on a tangent here, but
I mean, but it's also important to, as we mentioned earlier, to be straightforward about the fact that we are biased, and that we aren't trying to say that we're not biased, that this is, you know, an unbiased jellyfish representation. That representation itself is biased as well, because we are aware of the fact that we are choosing the aesthetically pleasing or the one that pleases myself at a specific point in time, because I'm actively curating from a folder of outputs. So there's that's on one side, and on the other side, to address what Lev mentioned earlier about Aaron Hertzman's paper, I think that's a absolutely valid point there. And
if I like was unfair, please tell me, because I have
not at all, not at all.
I only saw like 2 lines, and it was enough to send me screening. So please, you can defend him, but I just thought, you know, there is right, but we had basic idea of like difficult perception, ambiguity. So like, why not also bring it in like what we had for 100 years? But maybe I was
No, but I think it's very relevant, because it does put the finger on one of the issues, and that is digital arts, you know, has very recently become more legitimized in the eyes of, you know, arts in general. And it is a field that, because of its nature, because of its speed, struggles a lot to experience legitimacy. And that's why you've had this sort of, I think, push of also research attempting to like legitimize some of that, because there is a lot of production that just goes completely unseen from the mainstream perspective, because it occurs in these niche cultures of small varieties and, you know, angles that are very different and ways of working and topics.
And something that I particularly like about Hertzman's research is that we talk a lot about producing AI art, and a lot of the conversation to the public becomes, is the AI an artist in itself? Is the AI, you know, like aware or self-aware enough to make art, you know, whatever you want to call it. And what we often talk about is how that art is perceived. And that's what I like about Hertzman talking about who perceives the art, how do we perceive that work. And he has been working on automatizing to create tools that explore like the automation of looking for patterns in the art, in the pieces themselves, and using like computer vision systems to look to observe at the works. And that's something that I hadn't seen done before. And I was very happy when I found his research work, that he built systems to see if there's a way of quantifying aesthetics. He built systems to quantify how this visual indeterminacy, how much indeterminacy there is in an image, or there isn't, and that's to me, that's a fascinating thing to be talking about in the frame of the technology as well.
If I may jump in here, thank you guys so much for your contribution. I wanted to bring in a point that might help us all kind of start thinking about it in a different way, maybe. What I really appreciate about your work is that you kind of challenge AI with organic systems, right? You look at organic systems and then you look at AI. And that brought in my mind up that point that actually a few people have made. Gould has talked about it as exaptation, or we talked about Darwin. The Darwinian pre-adaptation is another thing, basically saying, Stuart Kaufman also talks about it, the adjacent possible, something that is truly novel. So he talks about the phenomenon, for example, lungfish. They had lungs, and these lungs filled by accident, basically by a mutation with water, and so became swim bladders. And that is a completely new environment that's created that then can be kind of occupied by new organisms. So it's completely new, and it's interesting that biology, Lev mentioned that biology is so interesting because it has this kind of like novel generator in itself. And I think it's interesting because on the other hand, you guys use AI, and you talked about it yourself, that kind of data always gets kind of extracted and also gets sorted out. So I think it's this inherent kind of conflict that's happening where you have the biological systems and then you have the AI systems, which are limited. And we all know that because we're still kind of at the developmental phase of it. And connectionism gets us much closer to a kind of like more entangled way of perceiving. It's more Humean, but I would say that we might have to push it further. And I think it's interesting that you guys work in that field, because I think it's very important to kind of think about these. And I think we need to be extremely critical about how we move forward with these technologies. And but I think it's important that we work with it, because an alienation is the danger. If we alienate ourselves from these machines by kind of being too biased and not working with them because we feel like they're going to take us away from certain developments and certain insights, then that's also the wrong idea. And so I think it's really interesting that you kind of set yourself up in that kind of conflict zone. And maybe you can also talk about, because I saw that you guys had this this jellyfish doesn't exist project, right? Where you kind of compare organic jellyfish that are generated by AI. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you kind of saw at that conflict zone or intersection. What did the machine generate versus the natural jellyfish that you see develop in the natural world?
Yeah, so this jellyfish does not exist. This kind of like was a sort of a fun little sort of exploration, because it exactly is. I think that's one of the ones that really sort of like, you know, for us made it really explicitly clear how, you know, as artists, we, especially working with AI, we rely on the data we can find, you know, collect or create. And when we sort of started, you know, then collecting images of jellyfish, you sort of like very quickly have to start making decisions about what constitutes a jellyfish. Is a jellyfish that's washed up on a beach and somebody's taking a picture of that, is that a jellyfish in the data set you want to have? Because that will start moving perhaps away from this living jellyfish to a different condition that perhaps becomes, you know, more of a muddy sand. And then what that meant was that we were already sort of making decisions based upon preference, upon how we would like to see a jellyfish represented. So it was like sort of a very it was kind of like a really sort of, it laid bare how subjective working with data is. Data is subjective. And when we then sort of also were, collecting these images, we can't, swim around all the oceans and take pictures of all the jellyfish ourselves, not within our current sort of grants. So we have to somehow, collect. And then people, when they take pictures of jellyfish, they generally tend to share pictures of that they somehow find beautiful or aesthetic or have some value to them. And then already there, we start to have this shift of bias. So these jellyfish are interesting because they are instantly recognizable as jellyfish. I haven't met anyone yet who's had a problem with recognizing one as a jellyfish, but at the same time, they only represent a very, very small slice of the actual diversity of jellyfish out there. It's just most jellyfish are so undocumented or non-visible or inaccessible that they just don't have any meaningful presence in a data set of 100,000 images to actually have any sort of influence on that distillation at the end. And yeah, it's kind of like, it's one of those things that sort of like really for us was like also is a way of practicing meditation by sort of, when we work with data sets, we often talk about it as meditations because you're focusing on a topic of a longer period of time or a subject. And as you do that, you become acutely aware also of what's not there, in that, what's not present in this meditation, what's missing, what's outside. And for us, that's also been a way to grow, a much greater appreciation and empathy for the natural world, because as I mentioned earlier, like what's an ugly jellyfish? Why do we have a preference to certain kinds of forms of jellyfish or shapes and pictures? Why are we pulled towards that? And that in that sense, it becomes very much a bearing of ourselves. We see ourselves reflected in that. And one could argue that, okay, that shows that's just humans are biased. Oh, great, it's hopeless. But no, I think that what this does is it shows that we have a worldview, we have, inherited and biological, etc. We have all these factors that influence our worldview. And if we want to try and expand that, we have to, first become aware of where are the boundaries of my world, where are the limits of my perception, and how can I start nudging that boundary a little bit further out, so it encompasses something more. And how does that change me? Because to see, to accept, to acknowledge, and to sort of incorporate that is to then also change and grow. And I think that's really where the potential of a lot of these things lies. I mean, that's why it's such an interesting thing as a practice, because it changes you to sort of like try and push your empathy for the more than human, to actually sort of like have some empathy for something that's, weirdly blobby and entirely unrelatable on an emotional level, If that helps answer, maybe.
Something which is relates to its larger questions, but also the technical things, because maybe it's a good opportunity to discuss it. Is that okay? Can I try?
Sure.
Yeah. So, since we're talking about evolution, right, and nature, and we're wondering to what extent, supervised machine learning, which uses deep neural nets, is similar to some extent, right, to the kind of biological processes and even operations of human cognition. And we're also talking about diversity. So I wanted to ask you this question, right? So this association of AI with very particular narrow technology, right, of neural nets, it's a very current thing, right? It's basically, it became popular 6 years ago, right? And before, people use different ways to do, right, AI, expert systems, all kinds of traditional deterministic algorithms. And there was a particular development, right, which was very promising in the second part of the 80s and 90s, which was in general called evolutionary programming, right, which is one of the general paradigms of programming, but it also had very interesting applications for arts and design, right, where you set up a system which explores a very large, right, huge space of possibilities, and the system kind of samples from a space and generates some designs. It can be like sounds, shapes, 3D forms, images, it doesn't matter, right? And then you select particular ones you find interesting, and then the system iterates, right? And I think it was extremely promising direction, but like many other directions, including traditional AI approaches, it didn't develop very far because computers were too slow. So I feel that we live in this very tragic period, right, where computers become really fast now. So we can go back and try a whole variety of approaches, which are all very promising. And I feel sometimes unfortunate. It's like, to me, when I think about neural nets, it's like you're taking Boeing 747 to go across the street to get coffee, right? It's this very heavy thing. So for example, if you really want to create some kind of diversity, right, why not just bring in traditional algorithms, right, and give them millions of parameters and use evolutionary programming, right? So, what I wonder, right, is in our obsession, right, to explore what we can do with neural nets, we kind of putting us sometimes in the corner. So my question is, in your work right now or earlier, have you been exploring the use of traditional algorithms, or for example, evolutionary programming or something else? Or have you kind of tried to combine, right, different kind of approaches, different kind of algorithms with supervised machine learning? And what do you think about it? Because I kind of feel like there's always amazing ideas, which now you can actually do it, except people forgot about them and now everybody's doing something else. But anyway, maybe it's just my old perspective of somebody who's been doing digital arts for 36 years now. So,
but Lev, why do they have to justify it? I mean, they're exploring. Does art have to be justified in that way?
No, okay, but I was just asking a question if exploring with different approaches as well. What, did I say something wrong?
No, there's nothing wrong.
Okay.
And we are definitely interested. That's why with Pelican, we often have the conversation about how we aren't, what our practice isn't focused just on AI. Our exploration isn't just about using AI only as a tool, and we're actually really interested in the various kind of like genetic algorithms, for instance, are fascinating. Cellular automata, they're a diverse set of algorithms that are just amazing tools that, to use and to explore, like parameterization, a procedural creation of diverse forms. So we are actually working on that as well.
No, absolutely. And I mean, I think like what's different now is, as you say, there's a very big difference in computational ability. So, I mean, we have been, especially over the last year or so, been looking a lot into sort of the 80s and the 90s and what occurred there. And also, but at the same time, we've also been trying to explore that also from the point of view, how does that mesh with, these current toolkits? How also aesthetically do we sort of like have them interact, because, due to limits of computation, a lot of these genetic algorithms, the way they were used and so on, also ended up with very clear, interesting aesthetic from that period, that's quite instantaneously recognizable. And now when we can do things quite differently, it's become sort of a question of like, how do we explore that space differently? So that's something we've been working on for a while, but it hasn't really reached a maturity yet that we're.
And when I show like inspirations for my work, I usually show like works from artificial life that were made in the beginning of the 90s or in the 80s.
Carl Sims, for example.
I'm usually like showing things that aren't necessarily made directly with what we now think as AI. And maybe like, for example, Carl Sims, like some of his works were made using what back then was a supercomputer, and even just the definition of supercomputer has changed throughout time, right? What we call now a supercomputer is a completely different thing than what it was back then. And yeah, that's one of the things that is fascinating too, is that this isn't something that is only available now. It was already available before, and it has been explored. And it is fascinating to look at like Google Trends and see how the term artificial life had like a really, the curve went up around the 80s and beginning of the 90s, and then it dropped. And it seems like there's not that much around the conversation of artificial life. But we realize that that's more where our work is more about artificial life than it is about AI on its own.
Absolutely. And I think also for us, a lot of the questions we're trying to sort of engage with are also like, how do we create interactions in digital space with more than human, but yet still artificial life forms? And how does that work? I mean, a lot of our daily life, you know, you see a pretty picture on Instagram, you like it, you move on. So, but at the same time, the digital space doesn't have to be for us. It's, you know, if you look sort of technically from the bottom up, you know, there's no reason a tree couldn't be on the internet, you know, and have some meaningful interaction digitally. I mean, there is, how do we sort of like, we often very much assume that our digital space, you know, is just human space, but how can we sort of explore, and that's kind of one of the lines we've been moving with artificial life, is like, how can we explore meaningful interactions? Because those are often what leads to empathy or empathetic connections.
Oh, and I also wanted to point something out that often I ask myself, like, how do we become artists? Like, are we artists on our own, like in a vacuum, or are we part of culture? Are we part of a society that decides whether we are artists or not? Right? And if we look at a generated piece on its own, there's often this thing of like, okay, what is this piece about? What is it trying to say? What's the context? And both Felican and I, we didn't start making art with AI. We were both making art before that. And we were both severely depressed, to be very honest. We were both working already on nature. We were both already interested. But society hadn't decided that we were artists. So we didn't feel entitled back then to call ourselves artists. Funnily enough, we only felt entitled to call ourselves artists when other people decided that we would be respected as such. I know that a lot of people go out into the world and gather the self-confidence to say, I'm an artist, everybody respect me like one now. But for us, it was that wasn't the case. It was the other way around. So Felican was working on an archive of trees, like really old trees, like thousands of years old in Norway, and building like this photogrammetry archive, kind of like to build a digital representation of these trees. And I was working on kind of like from amateurish nature documentaries, like documenting the natural world through like my own whatever photography, video. And and we both kind of had a crossroad. So so it's worth, sometimes it's also worth mentioning.
Yeah, if I may say something more, I think, and I really hope that you keep challenging, the preconceived notions, because I think it is very important as an artist to kind of start thinking about deeper issues that are within the technology that we use, and kind of challenge it, because you have a very unique way of challenging it. So make use of it. And I wanted to bring maybe a little bit further, because this is something I personally have been thinking about a lot, because I don't want to abandon the topic of AI, because I think it's so ubiquitous part of our society, but I also want to be critical of it, because I think as someone that is myself extremely interested in ecology, and as Sanford said, ecology of mind in a way, I think, and this is like something I have been coming up with just recently, I think it's interesting because AI, as Lev said, has kind of made a lot of progress in the direction of being more empiricist in a way, because it is connectionism. It's really built from the ground up, if you will. It's primarily qualitative data that then gets kind of like packaged and then becomes the system itself. So it kind of builds up. But I think it's interesting when you compare it to Hume, because Hume actually builds it up from the bottom up too, if you will, from the qualia. And but then there's an interesting criticism of Hume by Whitehead and by William James that are saying that Hume unintentionally actually pre-abstracts the data that he uses, and so ends up in a kind of solipsism, a world that is just for oneself. And that's getting dangerously close to what I actually, sorry, Neil, but I disagree with about the idea of hallucination, because then we all live in a world just for ourselves. And I think that's extremely dangerous. So Whitehead, as well as William James, they warn Hume, but they also warn us that kind of this not challenging this pre-sorting of data or pre-abstraction of data kind of leads us into a very dangerous territory, because it takes us out of the thick of the world that we're actually embedded in, and we actually need to kind of bring ourselves back. And so they advocate, and this is the word that Sanford used before, a more radical empiricism, to really look deeper and deeper. And we talked about the hallucination, the kind of flow feelings that are happening. And AI cannot have that. We can have that, and other organisms can have that. So I think it is important for us as people that are not exactly in the field of AI, but are kind of in the more aesthetic discourse, might have to challenge and think about how AI actually affects the way that we think about it. So it's a very inherent bias that sometimes just gets multiplied. And I think it is on us as artists, architects, people that are outside of the realm, but adjacent to it, to start criticizing it. And I would like to, hear other people's opinion about that. That's something that I kind of came up with myself over the years that I've been studying AI. And I think it's, for me, very important.
I just wondering that, I'm sure, I think most people would also, there are aspects of, let's say, the use of AI that are potentially quite terrifying. Of course, I also think there's a provocation in AI that maybe begins to challenge some of the assumptions behind what we think is to be human. I guess it's both. It's a very two-sided coin from that point of view, and I think that it causes us to reflect upon our own condition in an interesting kind of way. I don't think anyone's claiming there's any answers here, but I think what we saw today was some incredible explorations of the possibilities of what might open up. I don't think there are any claims being made as such, but it seems that there is something, there new terrain that we can explore and use it as a way of critiquing also what it is to be human. That would be my assumption. I don't know if we've got any other questions coming in from the audience. If anyone on YouTube wants to go and send a question in, please feel free.
Okay, I have a question. I have a question, and also just to pick up from the first comment, not to be like a question like out of context at all. But I believe I'm more afraid about us, no? I'm more afraid about human beings than about AI, because finally, what we do with it is what really matters in terms of. I agree that we need to be critical about, but we need to be critical about what we are doing right now, no, with our social issues, for example, that is like something that is challenging the relationship with technology. And my question is like, first a comment about your work that I believe it's a beautiful work what you're doing, Sofia, and both of you, and so I encourage you to continue with this. And the reason why I love what you're doing at the same time that I love what a lot of artists are doing as well, and architects working with AI, and is that in a way something that it could be also a critic about academies, is like we have like this kind of specialization of things, and you are crossing the borders with your practice, no? And I believe that's from, in my opinion, is really important, because it challenges us to question ourselves about some human issues, and also natural issues. And we are not biologists. I mean, we are not biologists. We are not engineers. We are not, so we don't have like this specialization, but anyway, we are like crossing the borders of the disciplines. And I believe that this is something that I wanted to put on the table of this conversation as well. And I would love to ask you about, how do you locate your practice? Where is your practice located, and how do you want to, if you can define your practice or define what you do, where is located? So that's my question. Thank you for the presentation. Wonderful.
Thank you, Marina. Thank you. You wanted to say?
Yeah, location is always difficult. I think for us, we've sort of been exploring like sort of how can we, pull back the curtain on how entangled we actually are with the world, because especially in the way our cultural narrative has gone, we have us, them, we have natural, artificial, we have nature, we have human, we have all these sort of binary divides. And very often any sort of like binary system is ultimately going to be incredibly limited and disappointing. And the reality is that we are, intrinsically entangled with the natural world, with each other. And when we say diversity and the importance of diversity, it isn't just about the importance of diversity, within the natural world, like biodiversity. It's also in diversity of humans, that we have, rich cultures and empathy also for each other. I mean, and how can we sort of like, for us, we focus, especially on the interface towards the so-called nature versus, and trying to sort of like create a sense of connection again, trying to sort of like help, hopefully creates experiences that can somehow sort of like help us understand how entangled and entwined we are with the world around us, and how there is no actual boundary. It's just like a sliding gradient between me and you and everyone else. So that's kind of like where we're located in that sort of like attempt. I think that's one way of putting it, I think. And I think that's also why, like, I think the topic of AI has been quite fruitful, not only in terms of like biodiversity, but also you have artists like Jake Elves, who works, with representation of, minorities like a drag culture, etc. These sort of things, and bring it, queer representation, which is just not present in, the standard machine learning data sets and models. And this is an artist who works with that, because I think that is also core to working with ecology, is, being able to also treat each other better and understand and empathize with each other. And that's so important. That's why all these different approaches all add up to something. And I think like that's really kind of for us, like as core, is just to do our way of exploring that. Yeah, I don't know if that sort of helps, but yeah.
No, that's very beautiful, and hence the name Entangled Others, I guess, your practice, right? We have actually, talking about entanglement, one of Marina and my students, Matthias Stankati, is here, and he's collaborating with Sofia. Matthias, would you like to say something? Can we?
Yes, thank you so much. It's really nice to see you guys' work here. It's a pleasure to have this interaction with you guys and seeing up close how both of your minds work. It's incredible work. And just something that I would like to add this whole conversation about, raising the question of what it is to be human. When looking at the work that you guys produced and looking at the book that Sofia talked about, every now and then, the Codex Serafinianus, I think it's something like that, by Luigi Serafini. The whole idea that he created this entire catalog of species that do not exist, but it's a mix of biology and art. But that's all created by the human mind, and then seeing this whole spectrum of species created by the machine, and things that could never be thought about before. Different ways of looking at biology and stuff, and it's nice to raise this question. Okay, machines could also create things like that, and what it gets almost like this rabbit hole. Like, are we different than machines? Can machines get up to our level? But I mean, that's perhaps a different topic. But it's a great work, and it's a pleasure to be here with you guys.
Thank you. I think I just wanted to add a thought to that, because I think I don't want to go into sort of the question of machines versus us versus them. That would be another binary divide. But I think what I think is important with all these things is that even though we work with systems that are typically thought of as black boxes, and I think that's often, purely technically, these are incredibly difficult to understand. But I think that ultimately what's very important is to be responsible, to assume responsibility for the tools we use, for these techniques that we engage with, the technologies that we engage with. I think that's incredibly important in this context. If it's art, architecture, social sciences, what have you, I think it's really important that we don't allow a narrative to, disempower ourselves and to somehow disavow ourselves of the consequences of those things. I think that especially with architecture and art, it's very important to own what we do, not as in the sense of ownership and this is my ego being expressed, but in that what I create has impacts and influence on the world and interactions, and I am, doing my best to be responsible and to, explore that. Just as a note.
Yeah, and I think just to go off of this, if anyone has worked with machine learning or training, it's not like you're pressing a button and it's generating. It is a extensive amount of work of collecting the data and training and really working with curating the process and everything. So it's not that I'm saying that machine is doing everything. And it is an impressive amount of work that you guys put into it, for sure. It is owned, for sure.
Libby, perhaps there's a comment in the chat from Mohammed Beju. I don't know if you can. Do you want to mention to read it out, Mohammed? Or Mohammed is actually teaching a workshop on 2 workshops on AI, and he's in Iran right now. Do you like to just to read it, or shall I read it myself?
Hello everyone. Hello Neil.
Hi,
Thank you. Salam. Thank you, Neil. I think not being concerned about AI is going to be problematic, because AI, as I say in the chat, it's a new tool that it is going to change our life or how we live as a language in the history. We know that when the humans learn how to speak, they interact with each other differently in a different manner. And as Wittgenstein says, there are some games in the language that are controlling our minds. Even some linguists they believe in it. Or maybe AI is going to be the next tool that changes our perception of the world and make us intelligent. Maybe we are not intelligent. Maybe we are not even that intelligent, I guess. Maybe it is going to make us intelligent, some intelligent creatures. And I guess we are in the middle of some important point of the history that it's going to be the next revolution of science, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Mohammed, one thing, and I don't know if I forget if I mentioned it today, but I think that the really key question is how do we understand intelligence itself? And I think sometimes we use these words, learning and intelligence and creativity, and somehow as though we project it onto that world of AI, as though it has quite the same way of operating. It's not quite the same thing at all. But nonetheless, I think it does expose in some ways the kind of limitations of what we can do in some areas. That's obvious. I mean, in case of playing Go or something, but I think it's important to be very careful not to come up with a kind of a blanket view about a technology, which is the term used for that is is technological determinism, as though a technology is good or bad. You know, I mean, I always say, you know, a kitchen knife, you can cut your vegetables or you can murder something with it. And it's important to be kind of aware of the possibilities of it in order to use it and harness it for the benefit of humanity, as far as I'm concerned. I don't think that it's. I'm writing 2 books, right? One is about the positive sides of AI. It's got a white cover, and one about the dark side of AI, which is a dark cover. And in many ways, to my mind, the challenge is not necessarily that. I mean, of course, it can be used for surveillance and God knows what else, of course, you know. But to my mind, the real challenge is about how terrifyingly good it could be at some things, not some things, not other things, you know. And I think that's really the challenge we have to look at. But I think it's important to. I mean, I really do think it becomes a mirror in which we can kind of start thinking about what our condition is, personally.
Neil, I'd just like to say one thing. I think you got the colors of your books mixed up.
And I wanted to add something, if possible, to this conversation. I think also I wrote a book on application of AI to smart cities. It's called Mindful Smart Cities. And in a section of my book, actually, I discuss about it is very important to understand what intelligence actually is and look at the different aspects and angles that intelligence is defined. So you can an intelligent person from a mathematical point of view, it means someone that is very efficient, fast at creating and calculating. But from interpersonal point of view, it might have a completely different definition and representation and posture in reality. So I really think there is a multiple theory. There is already a multiple theory of intelligence out there, put forward by Howard Gardner. So I think my argument is that actually we need to expand that to artificial intelligence as well, because it will be a multiple theory of intelligences. Then in that case, the artificiality, if you like, of the intelligence is subject to context, is subject to definition, to context, to many things. So intelligence becomes really something that can be tweaked, that can be changed, and therefore be used for or against human development. So for me, AI is really, as Neil said it really interestingly, it's a general umbrella of many kind of, I think maybe the emergence of the very first steps of creation of something, an extension of human intelligence, but necessarily doesn't stay there. So I think it will have its own evolutionary journey, as some people argue that AI can be change the direction to be defined positively or more evolutionary and more connected to human enlightenment. So I think it's best to stay kind of grounded when we speak about artificial intelligence, and also have in mind that our perception is always kind of one step behind what's happening. So we need time to really understand and reflect on the nature of intelligence, artificial intelligence, and test it and try it. So I think it's kind of like an evolutionary concept, like a DNA of us and AI evolving together, and I think refining each other. So, and I also believe in a good intention of humans. So this is something I have to say, that I'm on an optimistic side of artificial intelligence narrative. Thank you.
Thank you, Shima. We're going to have to wrap up. Can I just finish with one comment that comes from again from Mohammed in the chat, and that's to say, maybe we're not so intelligent enough to understand the full intelligence of AI. I'm not quite sure whether terms are right here, but one thing, I think this is a comment that was made by Alan Turing about, AI could write sonnets, but we wouldn't be able to appreciate it. And I think the point we found out in the kind of the famous move in Go, the AlphaGo move, was that where none of the experts could even understand the move. If AI produced something that was beyond our capacity to understand, we wouldn't understand it in the first place. And I think that's, from my point of view, I think it's important to engage with these technologies in order to go and challenge ourselves in many ways. So we're gonna have to wrap up, because we have to go into another. We have to surrender our live stream to another session. And I just want to thank the contributions today. Felican and Sofia, really beautiful, I mean, thoughts and work that, you know, provocations in many ways. And I think they, you know, stimulated a great conversation. It was great also to be able to kind of span the world. We had two Iranian voices, one in Iran and one in Belgium, commenting, and it's brought us together. This I think is simply the start of a conversation. I think it's really fantastic that we've opened up this thing, and hope to continue in the future. And we will be posting this online in our onto our website, so you can follow that as well. And I just want to simply say that on just to remind you, on Saturday, we for this session, we're going to have Wolf Prix, who's going to be presenting his work, where he's been exploring the possibility of how you can push these things in architecture. And I think it's, to my mind, something new is opening up. And you know, I think we have to be open up to these things, to Wondrous and so on. It's been and I think I just want to finish with this, the point that I found really beautiful about what Felican was saying. I think it's all, in the end, the key question is empathy, and how do we begin to empathize with the world around us in this way? And I think if AI can open up that, as opposed to leading to some kind of form of alienation, I think we've achieved something. So thank you for everyone all over the world. Thank you, Sanina in Romania and so on. We will be meeting again tomorrow at the same time. And thank you so much to Sofia and Felican. That was really, really beautiful work. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Yeah.